Hey there, welcome back. We're here to talk about the discussion section and how to write it. So let's get started. Before we start, what we're really going to do is take a look at how the discussion fits in your article. So you recall that in the introduction, you've proposed your main idea, your theory, your claims, what you want to test. The method described how you tested that idea. And the results section is where you make the case and provide evidence to justify your reasoning. And finally, in the discussion, what you're doing is you're making sense of it all. You're exploring the underlying meaning of your study, and you're also presenting how your study is going to contribute to the field as a whole. What does it all mean? How it all makes sense. So this is wrapping up your story. There are a number of elements that you'll find in your discussion section. You'll start with recapping your study. You'll connect it to the literature. You'll resolve any inconsistencies that have come up. And then you may discuss limitations, future directions, the implications for practice, and you'll end it off strong with a really fantastic conclusion. Let's start with the recap. So the recap generally is 1 to 3 paragraphs at the start of your discussion. And the overall structure is basically moves from the big picture to the study's findings. So you'll summarize the paper's driving goals. What was the purpose? What were the goals? What was the intent of your study? You'll describe some of your key findings, and then you'll show how the results fulfilled the aims and goals of your studies that you presented in the discussion. So if it's a well-written recap, the 1 to 3 paragraphs, a reader can get the gist of your study just by reading that recap. They'll know the rationale, they'll know what you did and found, and they'll get a sense of what it means. So let's take a look at what you do after your recap. So you've just finished your recap. You've successfully reminded the reader of your study goals, what you found, and how that relates to your study goals. The next thing you're going to be doing is situating your findings and your study within the literature as a whole. So you'll be drawing connections basically along the lines of 2 to 4 connective issues. And there are a number of ways that you could draw these connections to situate your findings within the field. So I'm going to give you some recommendations here in how to do that. One approach could be through theory. So one of these connective issues could be explaining what your findings mean for the field's major theories. Your study could have been investigating how something works. So how does your study change our understanding of processes, dynamics, and mechanisms, or why or when something happens? So as a result of your research, can we better predict when something will happen or gain insight into its causes? It can help explain a phenomenon or a construct. Is that construct simpler, more complex, or just completely different from what the field previously thought? You want to make this connection to maybe give ideas about how research should happen. So should we test, study, assess, manipulate, or sample differently? Are these samples that are typically used inappropriate for the greater population? And you may also decide to look at how your findings relate to claims that have been made in the literature. So do your findings extend these claims? Do they differ from them? These are all things that you can do to draw these connections and questions you could ask yourself in how to situate your findings within the field as a whole. The next essential element of your study is resolving anything that might have been unexpected or that happened in your study. So there are 2 main types of issues that you might address. One is that your findings might have contradicted predictions or established findings in the field. Alternately, there might have been methodological issues that came up. So for example, were you unable to recruit? Did the pandemic happen mid-study and affect your ability to sample and possibly change the design of your study? Were there problems with the measure that you used? Was it not effective with your population? Was the manipulation that you thought you had done ineffective? Those are all types of issues that you're going to need to resolve and convince the reader by addressing them explicitly that these aren't fatal flaws. And there are 2 main ways that you could address the unexpected issues that came up in your study. One possibility is citing other studies that might have found similar issues arise, similar unexpected findings. Alternately, you might propose future research to address the issue. So unexpected things will happen in your research. You may have unexpected findings. Things might not work the way that you had hoped they would or expected them to. Don't sweep it under the carpet. What you want to do is straight up address them and present to the reader why this isn't a fatal flaw, why this is something that your study still is trustworthy and that future research can address it, or this may actually reflect a phenomenon that's happening in other studies as well, that's happening in the field that theoretically we haven't addressed yet. This next section is the limitations, and you may or may not have to deal with that. So if you were resolving methodological issues, if you were resolving unexpected findings or design issues that might have been unique to your study previously, then those might also have been the limitations and you might have already addressed them. However, some journals want specific limitation sections. So typically if it's required, then you definitely want to make sure you have a limitation section and limit it to a single paragraph. So you want to comment on the importance of whatever that limitation is for the interpretation of your results, but it's also really important to address why those limitations aren't fatal flaws and frame it as a direction for future research. So think of these limitations, any limitations that you might report, as a guilt-ridden way of saying, here's a future direction for research. So when you acknowledge the limitation, you also need to recognize that your study can't do everything, but you also want to point out that what you did very well. So no study is able to do everything and use every single variable that could potentially exist, and that might be considered a limitation. However, what you did provided good insight on that issue you were addressing. Some journals require future directions and others do not. So you might have already addressed future directions when you were either talking about limitations or talking about the issues that you've resolved. So this may or may not be a required separate section, but you don't want it to be more than a paragraph. And if you do have a future direction subsection, you'll provide one or two recommendations. Don't provide a future direction as something that you could have easily addressed in your study. If you have a future direction that addresses something that could have easily been done in your study, the reviewers may read it and say, well, why didn't they do this in the first place? And consider it a flaw for your study. Another thing is that you don't want the future directions to be so sexy and appealing that the reviewers will say, well, why didn't you do that study instead of the one you did? So you want the future research not only to address issues that you may have addressed, but a really strong approach to future directions is to build on the strengths and how future research could expand on the strength of your study and a unique finding of your study. So future directions can also be used as a way to build on the strengths that are in your study. And when you're writing for the readers and for the reviewers and the editors, you do want to make it clear that there are a lot of strengths in your study that's worth publishing. The next section that sometimes is controversial in social science is implications for practice. And that's because not all social science research is practice-oriented. It may be basic research understanding neurological processes that may be a real stretch to relate it to policy or practice. However, a lot of educational research is designed specifically to inform practice or policy. So you very likely will be including an implications for practice section. You might have addressed implications for practice, for example, if your study and research questions were directly related to practice or policy oriented issues. But you do want to make sure that you have one or two explicit ways in which your research can inform practice or policy. At this point, you might be feeling kind of tired and burned out and ready to just end your paper. And when it comes to the conclusion, people might ask, do I really need to do it? I'm done. Well, it's a great idea to have a conclusion. Not all the authors do it, and for short papers that are just a few pages long, then they might not include a conclusion. But a conclusion is a chance to leave the reader with a really strong understanding of your study's strengths and contributions. So it's your final paragraph. You can signpost that as your final conclusion by having final thoughts or conclusions as a subheading. You could start the paragraph with, in conclusion, we found, and in that paragraph, you'll describe the major ideas, findings, and implications. So you might answer questions such as, what did you find and what does it mean? Or how does your work contribute to the big picture? So a sentence frame that you might use is, because of the results of this study, we can now tackle problem X with method Y, bringing us to the ultimate goal of Z. So the key thing to keep in mind is that with the conclusion, this is a chance to emphasize the strengths and contributions of your study. I hope these slides were helpful for you, and good luck writing your discussions.